All right. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us on our June webinar. Today we've got Andy Ginder with Allied Reliability Group with us to talk to us about the annual M&R Checkup. And being 6 months into the year now, it's probably a good time to kind of revisit those New Year resolutions and those promises and goals we all made to do better and to that continuous improvement model. So I think this is the perfect time to kind of get us all back in line and see how we're doing with our goals and what's going on with our reliability programs at our facilities. So we hope everybody enjoys the session today. Just a couple introductory slides. UE Systems, so we've been doing ultrasound for over 40 years now, offices worldwide, but obviously we're always happy to be able to do a little bit more than just ultrasound. We're happy to provide these webinars every month and have folks like Andy come in and share kind of the bigger picture, so not just the ultrasound piece, but the bigger reliability piece that obviously ultrasound plays a part in. So we're happy to have these webinars. And today we've got a special recognition to Plant Services Magazine for their sponsorship of our webinar. Great resource, their website, the magazine, just all kinds of great information. And at the end of the webinar, I'll actually show you a link where you can go and read an article that Andy actually wrote kind of on this same topic that's up there for you guys to get just a little bit extra once this webinar is over. So again, thank you to Plant Services. And before I welcome Andy, just a couple housekeeping notes for you all. I am recording this, so if you have to pop off or if you've got colleagues that just couldn't make it, we will put this up on our website, so it'll be available for folks to view it at their own time. And also, if you have questions throughout the session, there is a questions box. You can just type those in. I'll be monitoring those, and if it makes sense to kind of interject and get those questions answered throughout the presentation, that's what we'll do. Otherwise, we've of course got some time slated at the end of the session for some of those questions as well. So without further ado, I will pass the screen over to Andy and let him take it away.
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
It's taken just a second, but it's probably loading up. There you go. And you're ready. All right. Thanks, Andy.
All right. Well, I want to welcome everybody to the presentation. First of all, just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I've been in the consulting business for 30 years, and benchmarking or doing reliability assessments has always been a key area of interest for me. I had the opportunity to actually be one of the lead developers for what was the old HSB Reliability Technologies world-class reliability benchmarking process. And I've had the opportunity also to work with a couple of major corporations on developing their own internal mechanism for assessing their sites. And I happen to do that with companies such as Ford Motor Company, BP Refining, Sasol, and so forth. And last year I also had the opportunity to work with ExxonMobil as their downstream operation wanted some input in terms of how they were conducting assessments at their sites. So I've always found it very interesting to look at what the pros and cons are of the various ways that you can actually evaluate your organization. And I plan on sharing some of those insights in this presentation today. One of the first key questions I think you always have to ask yourself is, why are we doing this? What's the reason for doing an assessment or a benchmark? And unfortunately, a lot of companies really do it just for the sake of doing an assessment. It's like, you know, we want to check the box. We've assessed ourselves. We've evaluated ourselves where we're strong and weak. But the unfortunate thing is that they don't really have any true desire to improve their business. There's no true intent to really impact the business processes that they are currently employing. And if companies really want to get the value out of doing an assessment, the assessment itself is just a starting point. It really is just the key to helping you move forward on a long-term engagement for improving your productivity and performance of your equipment and people. Now, if you talk about reliability, I tend to recommend to clients that they take a corporate approach to it. It tends to be a lot more cost-effective for them over time. But if you look at it in terms of what your objectives are, if you improve reliability, you're going to improve your financial, safety, and regulatory performance. And you're going to really be able to produce at the optimal cost, be able to get your product to market at the desired time, and so forth. But to achieve that objective, there's a lot of different things you have to do, and I listed a couple of them right here. I mean, you need to have a governing structure, a leadership structure that's going to really drive or lead the whole change process. You need to define what are your metrics and create your corporate level and your plant level scorecards. You need to actually figure out what are our strengths and our weaknesses. And I always tell companies not to overlook their strengths because, especially on a corporate basis, you have the opportunity to take those strengths from one site and transfer them to another organization. But at the same time, you need to look at where are our weaknesses and figure out how you're going to close those gaps. But that leads you into designing plans of action, both strategic and tactical. And you have to figure out how we're going to transfer knowledge because there's going to be a lot of information that needs to be shared across the organization. And you're also going to look for opportunities to standardize your processes and actually benefit your cost structure as a result. If you have similar equipment in a plant, obviously you don't have to redesign that PM from scratch or the predictive technology from scratch for that equipment. You can share that information with sister plants. But this slide simply just shows you some of the objectives for taking a corporate approach to reliability. Now there's certain megatrends that are going on, and a lot of companies say, well, should we or should we not have a assessment process, an ongoing assessment process in our organization? And a lot of major companies have actually come up with an overall strategy for managing operational excellence or even for managing reliability. And in most of these cases where they've developed an operational excellence model, they've chartered corporate groups with responsibility for helping drive continuous change. And I don't know in the organizations you're at if they have that corporate reliability function, but it is very prominent in a great number of organizations. And those people play a variety of roles. They're the guardians of best practices, they're educators, they're coaches, they're mentors, they're assessors, etc. But in many of these companies, some of them have designed their specific corporate model of reliability, and oftentimes they engage outside resources to support those activities. Other times corporations decide rather than create their own model of reliability, they'll just take some proprietary models that have already been designed by consulting groups or associations and evaluate themselves against that. But regardless of which approach a company takes, what I usually try and encourage them to do is be consistent in that assessment approach, so they're not using something different all the time. Now, when I said some major companies are doing this, this just gives you an idea of some of the companies that are looking at reliability and operational excellence on their organizations, and they're using an assessment process to evaluate where their sites stand. Now, these assessments can be internal or external in some of the cases. By internal, what I mean, it's completely done by resources at the site. External means they're bringing people in from outside the site, which might be still within their corporation, or could even be people from outside of their corporation, whether they're consultants or whatever it happens to be. The one thing that I've seen is that on these major corporations, some of them mandate the assessments to be done on a periodic basis. Others are more flexible than that. They may just say, look, within 5 years, do it one time or something of that nature. But the critical failing that I've seen in many of these is they go through the assessment process, though, but they really don't change their behavior or their culture after they go through that assessment. And that's greatly a great reason of that is because they don't build in accountability, and they don't really learn from what they could learn of the assessment itself. So nothing really changes. But if you think again about megatrends, our standards, regulations, certifications, etc., everything related to reliability, those standards are becoming more common and more rigorous. So whether you're talking about ISO, PAS 55, OSHA 1910, etc., and a lot of these are driven by major incidents. Now, these incidents aren't necessarily always caused by reliability problems, but the issue still holds true that reliability could be at the base of incidents that create situations like this. So whether you're talking about BP's Deepwater Horizon incident or the plant explosion in Texas or whatever, all those things are just leading to more and more regulation. And so that comes to the bottom part of this slide, which is my point that so reliability is recognized as an essential underpinning of safety, operational, and financial performance. And the reality is, when people talked about just-in-time or things of that nature, you don't have reliability in your organization unless you've got good maintenance practices, unless you can count on availability of equipment. But you also need that formal governance structure. You need to have internal reliability standards developed. You need to require recurring assessments You need to require continuous and rapid change. And I always highlight the word rapid. 30 years ago when I started consulting, people weren't even interested in continuous change. Back in those days, we thought that in North America, we were the premier manufacturing countries in the world. And then we started getting our feet held to the fire by Japan, Germany, and other countries. So people started continuously improving. And today, I would say pretty much all plants are making improvements. It's the rate of change that's really the question. And the people that are going to be leaders in their industries are going to be the ones that are focused on continuous and rapid change. Because if you're not changing faster than your competitors are going to leapfrog you. But the last one, too, it says, if you're doing benchmarking assessments, the achieved improvements that you get that result from the benchmarks should be valued over the assessment score itself. The assessment score is just a tool. It should drive you toward improvements. So how do we govern the process? First, a few guiding principles. I think that the company owns the process. You may be using consultants or whatever, but you have to take charge of the whole process and get the support you need from external resources if they're needed. The company needs to be accountable for the assessment results and the development and implementation of recommendations. If they're not involved in that, if the consultant does it all by himself, nobody's going to take a lot of interest in it because they're going to feel that's the consultant's recommendations. The people won't own them themselves. So you need to manage the assessment output, whether that's the findings, the recommendations, action plans, etc. Another principle is that the focus should be on learning and on structured continuous improvement. As I said before, put more focus on that than on the assessing and the scoring. Another item is that you don't want the process to cause major disruption to your normal plant activities. And there's a lot of different ways you can benchmark. You can use electronic online tools. You can send squads of people into the site, etc. I tend to feel the best way to go is to use some sort of combination of those. Online tools can grab a great bit of information for you. And then you may just want to send in a small team for a short period of time to clarify some points or to really do a deep dive in a couple areas that look like they have some key areas for opportunity. The other thing is that a couple of key things is that, I believe that robust periodic assessments should be required, not voluntary. Reliability is just too critical to let some companies or sites decide they want to opt out of it. And as I said before, the increasing regulations and standards just highlight the need for having specific requirements and ways to measure your compliance with them. The other thing is that those robust periodic assessments help increase accountability. And sometimes it's like I get the feeling that people, we don't want to, the plants will feel bad if they get a bad low score or something like that. It's not about getting a bad or a good score. It's really about whatever score you get, how do you move forward? But then how do you make sure that you're going to move forward by assigning accountability to people? You don't want to have a situation where you have casual compliance when people pay lip service to it. They really got to be serious about going forward and changing their business processes. So for some recommendations, I say create a robust governance structure, establish key executive sponsors, and concrete activities that they can demonstrate their support by. So you need to get them out and visible at key points, whether you're having meetings at the plants or whatever it is. That executive sponsor needs to be talking about the assessments and the benchmarks and what impact they're having on the organization itself. The other key thing is, besides executive sponsors, is having a formal communication strategy built together. You may tell people something once, but they usually don't retain it. You tell them it twice, and they may remember it. You tell them 3 or 4 times, and all of a sudden it starts getting through to them. But you need to keep a steady stream of communication going to the sites about what's been done, what's been achieved, what's going to be done in the future, how are they going to be impacted, and so forth. And I did just put a couple of charts just showing what that governance structure might look like. And you can see over here on the right side of your screen, you have an executive sponsor with possibly a corporate champion. You might merge these positions or that, but these are the high-level people that are really going to drive the process and provide the support that's needed to move forward with it, whether it means funding support, etc. Over here, you may actually have a council that you picked representatives from different corporate functions, production, maintenance, etc., who are also going to help drive the process throughout the multiple sites. And you may have an individual coordinator who's going to do a lot of legwork for you, supported by some other facilitators. And you may actually have some outside consulting support over here. But 3 key things that are done at the corporate level are you have to determine what the corporate scorecard is. what are the key performance indicators we're going to measure, whether it happens to be maintenance costs percent of RAV, OEE, maintenance downtime, etc. What are the best practices you're going to focus on and evaluate, and how do you transfer knowledge to your organization about what good is or what a best practice is versus a poor practice. But if that's the corporate side, this gives you a little bit more of a look at what it might look like on the site basis. Your champion on the site typically is your plant manager. You may have a corporate facilitator and a plant coordinator working with you to do the assessment and to implement changes as a result of it. You may also support your team by consultants, etc. But your leadership team, your typical natural leadership team, is usually the key group that's going to help drive the process throughout the organization. And you will probably form some focus groups or action teams among the key areas of opportunity that are identified as a result of the benchmark or the assessment. Now, some people say, well, do we need to have an outside people supporting us on this? And of course, I'm a consultant, so I'm a little biased on that, but I do think there's great value for having at least a some minimal support by outside organizations. Part of it's to make sure that you get an objective, unbiased view of the organizations. When you bring somebody to the outside, they typically aren't wired into all the politics, so they're not worried about, well, I may step on somebody's toes, et cetera, and not get a promotion from them and so forth. So they can give you a clearer view of what you're actually seeing, and it avoids that tendency toward confirmation bias. If you're going to a plant and all the people already happen to think they're doing a pretty good job at things, but when they go out to look at whether they're doing a pretty good job, they're predisposed to finding things that reinforce their current belief. So that can be a problem. That's confirmation bias. You look for things that confirm what you already believe instead of looking for things that maybe would unconfirm it. Also, consultants can potentially provide some subject matter expertise you might have, and they can also help you steer away from going into the two extremes of the assessment, which means like, hey, everybody feels good about everything we're doing, or everybody feels that, hey, we've really been beaten up on and everybody was holding our feet to the fire. So you need to find a middle road. You want to identify where the opportunities for improvement are, but do it in a constructive manner. So when you talk about what are the standards against which we're going to measure ourselves, this is a sample from one of the companies I mentioned earlier. Actually, I can mention the company because I pulled this down from their corporate website. This is Chevron, and this is their operational excellence assessment process. And if you look at it, they've got three key drivers for it. They talk about leadership accountability, which is, we already mentioned, that you need to have that governance structure in place. They talk about a management system process, which has 5 steps. And then they have 13 expectations or 13 elements for their operational excellence process. And if you look at those 13, you can see that one of them happens to be reliability and efficiency. And so it's just a sample to show you some of the things that companies are looking at and assessing, because at Chevron, they assess these 13 elements as part of their operational excellence program, and they do it on a periodic basis. I think it's every second or third year the sites have to go through that process. This is just a different one here looking at it, and here you can see looking at management leadership as the key area, facilities design, personnel and training, operations and maintenance, etc. And if you look under operations and maintenance, some of the things they look at. The whole point I'm really looking at and just showing these to you is that what you have to do up front is figure out what is it we're actually going to evaluate. If we're focusing exclusively on reliability, what are the elements within reliability? Do we look at management leadership for reliability? Do we look at how we're organized structurally? Are we going to look at our PM, PDM? Are we going to look at planning and scheduling? You have to figure out what are you going to look at those things and what tells us whether we're doing it well or not doing it well. Besides the practices, you also have to figure out, well, what are the metrics we're going to look at to measure the success of applying those practices. Because if you think about it, all the metrics tell you is really how well you're doing in certain areas. But the practices are the things that will help you make improvements in those metrics. So you've got to figure out, what are we capturing today? Are those the right things? Do we want to have a corporate scorecard that requires the plants to report up 5 or 6 key reliability indicators every month? And if so, what are the other indicators that we feel it's important for the plants to record, even if they don't have to report them up to us? Other issues you have is how do we get at a consistent definition for the indicators? I mean, if you start tracking maintenance costs at one plant, you may capture certain things that aren't captured at another location. I've seen some sites that roll in their power plant costs into their maintenance department. So you've got to make sure you're trying to capture apples to apples, and you need good definition of those indicators then. But then you have to ask yourself, how do we use the indicators? How do we train our people to use them? What do they mean if they go in one direction versus the other? Do people understand the difference between leading and lagging indicators, or financial versus process, or customer and growth indicators, etc.? And so these are all questions you have to look at, whether it's reporting structure and so forth. And this is just one way I tend to put them together myself. I use a variation of the balanced scorecard, and I don't know if you're familiar with that concept. It was written up in a book by Bob Kaplan, a Harvard professor, and Dave Norton, who is the owner of Renaissance Consulting, or the leader of Renaissance Consulting. They published a book on it. They identified that really there should be a balanced suite of indicators, and that typically companies tend to focus excessively on financial indicators. Well, the drawback to financial indicators is that they only tell you where you've been. They don't give you an indication of where you might be in the future. So their point was that you need to look at other things that can give you a good feeling that maybe you're going to be doing better or worse in the future. And one of them is you look at internal business processes, which really means if you decide it's important to do all of your PM, you track PM compliance. It doesn't mean your equipment performance is necessarily going to improve, but at least you know that you're doing it all the time that you plan to do it. So if your equipment isn't improving, it's really an issue of what type of PM you may be doing on it. Also, they talk about learning and growth, which really is investing in your people and in the tools they have. And in those two cases, if you're doing good things on internal business processes and learning and growth, it increases the probability that you'll continue to improve on the financial side of your business here. And the last one, in Kaplan and Norton, they talk about customer indicators. I tend to look at customer indicators from a reliability standpoint as being the equipment itself. So I usually look at things such as OEE and availability, and so forth. And the reason for that is I like to think of maintenance and production as being partners in servicing an internal customer, with the internal customer being your equipment. And if you service your equipment properly, if you feed it the right raw materials or intermediate materials, if you start it up correctly, if you maintain it and repair it in the proper manner, you get a given result, which means you get good reliability. So for me, the customer one tend to be more oriented toward the equipment itself. But you can track your indicators different ways. This just shows one way where you can look at one site to see how it scored against the indicator versus other companies that were plants that have been evaluated by the assessment process. And over the left hand it shows world-class performance. So when you're talking about maintenance costs as a percent of replacement asset value, your target's 1.5 to 2%, although that can vary on different industries. And here's this individual facility here versus the other industries in the benchmark database. And you can also track the overall site scoring. This is another way that I've seen done, where companies actually break all the sites into quartiles, or every site that's been benchmarked is put in a quartile. And you can see you've got a first, second, third, fourth quartile here. The star actually reflects where that individual site was, so it shows that they were in the second quartiles and so forth. And when you're benchmarking a lot of sites within one corporation or in numerous corporations, a lot of times there's sensitivity about reviewing the individual site who got different scores. So there's different ways that you can blind their names, et cetera, but still show them where they stood against their peers, which is a motivating factor for many of them. Okay, so we talked a little bit about you got to identify what practices you're going to benchmark, you got to identify what indicators you're going to look at, and you have to educate people, though, in the benchmark process or the assessment process. And I usually use this slide here to talk to people about for getting lasting change. And on the left it says, if you start with awareness and then you couple that with an analysis. So let's say you're doing a benchmark, you kind of thought you might have had a problem in planning and scheduling, you go in and you do the assessment, you really analyze it in detail, then you come out with a true understanding of what your issue and your need is. If you couple that then with an action plan where people are accountable for making changes, the fact they're accountable gives them ownership over it, and you couple their ownership with understanding, that helps you bring lasting change in the organization. So that's one way that I kind of show how you need to bring the change process into play for a company. But if you talk about, okay, what's our overall assessment strategy and schedule, these are some of the recommendations that I would typically make. You should really do a major, and I say external, which means it's not just done by the people on the site, but it's probably got corporate representatives and maybe consultants involved. That's up to their decision, but it should be a major detailed assessment every 2 to 4 years. Coupled with that, you should have a monthly progress report. Usually it's just going to be a page or so. It's one-liners about what progress you've been made, and you may have a Gantt chart that you put with it that gets updated to show progress. Because when you do the benchmark or the assessment, it's key that you come up with an implementation strategy of how you're going to grab improvement potential. And one of the ways to keep your status on that is to do a monthly progress report. The other thing then is doing health checks. And as opposed to the major detailed assessment every 2 to 4 years, we're talking about doing a health check, say, every 6 months or every year. And really that's a little bit more informal. You may have a shorter on-site duration than you would with a major detailed assessment time period. And on the health check, you may focus on individual elements or key areas of opportunity that were identified in the major assessment as benefiting potentially from additional attention. But also ongoing, whoever the support group is, they should be providing additional support in the terms of workshops, coaching, mentoring, etc. So when you look at the chart, it just kind of shows you a little bit of a timeline with external assessments every 2 years, monthly reports, health checks every 6 months, and then with various supportive workshops, coaching, etc. on an ongoing basis by corporate resources or outside consultants. Then if you look at your major external assessment schedule, normally your primary activities will take place on-site in a 2 to 4 calendar week time frame depending on the site size. If it's a small site, obviously it'll take less time. If it's a huge site, it might take more time. There's always a couple of schools of thought. Some people think it's better to go in with 10 people for 1 week and get it all done in one quick week there so you're out of the plant fast. Others tend to go with, say, well, let's put 3 people there for 3 weeks instead and spread the time out a little bit more. I tend to favor that latter approach myself. I feel it gives people more time to absorb the findings you're coming up with and to buy into the changes that you're suggesting that they make. But the key thing, again, the point I made earlier is that it's not so much about assessment as it is about learning. And I'm going to talk about that later. I mean, the whole benchmark and assessment process should actually be a learning process for your organization. And it's one that really should touch all the layers and functions of the organization itself. Now, on the chart here, you can see I laid out a sample 7-week schedule, but the main activities take place, as I said before, in weeks 2 through 4. So you can see you might do a workshop in advance to educate people about what you're going to be doing. You might have some advanced site prep work where you ask the plants to send in some data to you so you can take a look at it. But then the on-site portion takes place in weeks 4 through 6. And that's evaluation, strategy development, and some interventions, which I'll talk about. And then you have a report out when your formal documentation is given back to them. So you can stretch out or you can condense those type of activities as much as you want, and also based on the size of the site. So now how do we capture key information and how do we convert benchmarking into a true learning exercise? Okay, one of the things that I think is becoming more popular and which I recommend strongly is getting the opportunity to use some of the new automated electronic surveys that are out. These can be used both for your major assessment and also for the health check. The benefit for the automated surveys is that they're less costly and they're less intrusive to the organization. So people can fill them out at their own time and feed back to you their information on where they stand in their organizations. And you still have the chance to go in afterwards to dig a little bit deeper based on what the automated surveys are telling you. Now, also I talk about targeted walkabouts. So let's say you did an electronic survey, and typically I recommend doing that in advance, and then you want to go dig a little deeper into places. Well, you can do targeted walkabouts, which really means sitting in on or participating in various activities to see how they actually unfold in reality. On a survey that somebody fills out, they may tell you, well, we do a good job in such and such and such and such, but when you sit down the meeting, you may find that it doesn't look like it goes quite as smoothly as they say. So this gives you an opportunity to validate that. And also it gives you an opportunity to educate the people on what they need to do better. So if they're planning and scheduling meetings start up late, if the physical condition of the equipment, if you're going through it and you're seeing, hey, there's all this rust or there's all this refuse that's laying around, you can point those things out and talk about those. But they're all things that are supposed to not just identify opportunities for improvement, but also help educate people on the need for that improvement. But you can also do some process mapping, you can gather metrics, and you can have some formal targeted interviews with people to support what you gather from, say, automated surveys. And this is just a sample of one here where people responded to a particular statement. Did they agree or disagree with it? If they put a 1, it meant they strongly disagreed. If they put a 2, or they strongly agreed. If they put a 2, they moderately agreed. 3, moderately disagree. 4, moderately disagree. Strongly disagree. 5, not applicable. And they broke the responses out by function. So that's just one sample output from a different type of electronic survey you can get. But as far as making your assessment a learning experience, it's the interventions that I think are very valuable. And so when you do your assessments, I typically recommend that you incorporate into them a series of activities that involves personnel from the site. And usually for each exercise, you may be asking for anywhere from 3 to 6 site people to participate in it. And the exercise is typically going to be facilitated by an outside resource, whether it's somebody from corporate or from the consulting group, etc. You try and keep them normally to 3 to 4 hours so it doesn't overwhelm people with the time duration, and it's focused on a specific activity. So examples of that would be what I call the hidden inventory exercise, where maybe a outside corporate resource would lead a team of 3 people through an area of the plant, or even the whole plant depending on the size, identifying the hidden caches of material that people tend to squirrel away. And then making decisions about, should it go back to the storeroom, how should it be handled, is it obsolete stuff that's out here and just needs to be gotten rid of, or whatever it happens to be. But that's an opportunity to teach people what good practices are and actually make some changes in the organization. Cycle counting is the same. People, we've seen some cases where organizations did use cycle counting, but they weren't applying it correctly. So it gives a chance for somebody to make sure that people are actually doing cycle counting the proper way. Preventive maintenance evaluation, I'll show you a little sample of that in the review. But all these are just a sample of just some of the different types of shorter exercises you can do when you get teams of people and you take them through the site to look at a particular activity. And I suggest that normally companies try to build up a toolkit of 20 to 25 exercises that they can use in this manner that will teach people but also validate what level of maturity that they happen to be at as an organization. And these are just a couple of sample exercises. This is one, it's called Preventable Maintenance. It really just means looking at a group of repair work orders. Say you take the repair work orders for 1 month from an area in the plant, and you get a cross-functional team together, operators, maintenance people, an engineer or 2, etc. And you're asking them a basic question. If you had done something differently, something that you logically could have been expected to do differently, would you have ever had this repair be needed? And you can see from this one right here, the answer was that people came back and said, well, 53% of the stuff we weren't going to prevent that, we weren't going to foresee it or anything like that. But they also said 3% of the repair work orders, we wouldn't have had to do them if we had designed things correctly in the first place, or maybe if we had maintained it properly, if we had done the PM on schedule that we were supposed to, or maybe we hadn't even developed any PM for it when we obviously should have. In this case, 24% was related to operations, which, if you think about it, if we don't start up the equipment correctly, if we don't operate it properly, if we don't shut it down according to correct procedures, those all have the capability for creating problems from us. Management might even contribute to it. We may tell them about a problem and ask them to take the equipment down, and the management says, no, we want to run it through the weekend to get this last order out, and they make a risk-based decision that doesn't turn out correct. But that's one sample type of exercise that can usually be done in 3 to 4 hours. This is one where looking at your PM, it really says taking a look at the PM you've got and developing sorts of criteria for whether that PM is value added, whether it would be better off being assigned to an operator, whether it should be put on a formal lube route, whether it should be replaced with predictive technologies, whether it should be re-engineered, or really whether it's as good as it is, and there's no modifications needed. But if you look at this particular one, you can look at the number of tasks that were reviewed, and you can look at how many hours it represented, but then look at how many hours were good PMs as opposed to how many should be re-engineered or replaced with predictive maintenance, etc. So in this case, there was a big opportunity. But you can always go into an organization and do an exercise of this sort on a small scale to see if there seems to be an opportunity. And if there seems to be an opportunity, you can expand that scale. The other thing about doing the benchmark assessment is you should come out with a formal strategy on how you're going to improve. It should be an MS project schedule or whatever it happens to be, some sort of Gantt chart, but it should identify what are the steps, what are the areas of focus, what's our timeline, who's accountable, etc. And if you aren't going to go into that phase, I mean, you might as well not have done the benchmark in the first place. But as you go through and build that strategy, you should also be thinking about what are the quick wins we have and how are we going to rank our opportunities priority. And so this just shows you a little sample here. I mean, it is important to get quick wins. So if you look at the upper right-hand quadrant, those are the ones that require low effort but provide potentially high return. Those are the things that you want to go after right away. And those are the things that will hopefully, if you address them successfully, they will drive improved financial performance, which will free up money for you to go after other areas of opportunity. But you will find that for some of the quick wins, some of them have hard dollar returns. In other words, you'll be able to measure them on the bottom line. You'll see that there's an actual reduction in overtime or a reduction in parts use, whatever it happens to be. But there are also some that will have soft dollar returns, which can be valuable if they help drive support for the process in the organization. There are sometimes things that you might find that people think are very important, even though they don't have a high dollar impact on the budget line. So for your deliverables then, you should have the overall performance results. You know, where do you stand? Are you at a level 5 out of 8? Or do you score 400 out of 450 or whatever it is, whatever scoring mechanism you built? You need to have specific actionable areas of opportunity that you can go after. And you should have a plan of action of how you're going to grab those, which means the Gantt chart. And then finally, you need to have your communication strategy for reporting on progress. So then, how do we embed accountability? The one thing I always talk about here, I said self-sustaining is a myth. I mean, I've talked to many executives and they said, okay, if you come in and you work with my people for 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever the time frame, after you're done and gone, they're just going to keep on doing this automatically by themselves, aren't they? And I tell them, no, that's the case. And they say, well, how can that be? I mean, you're teaching them best practices. If it's the best practice, why wouldn't they automatically keep doing it? And I actually raised that question one time in a conference when I was speaking, and I asked everybody in the conference room, I said, how many of you know that if you work out 4 or 5 times a week for a half an hour or so, you're likely to live a longer, healthier life? Almost everybody raised their hand. Then I asked, I said, how many people know that if they eat lean foods, more chicken rather than red meat, more vegetables and fruit rather than processed foods, if they cut back on the desserts, how many know they're likely to live a longer, healthier life? Almost everybody raised their hand again. And both of what I just mentioned are good practices. People knew about those good practices. But then I said, well, how many of you exercise 4 or 5 times a week, plus eat a good diet? And there were maybe 1 or 2 hands that came up. And the point is that good practices by themselves aren't going to drive people to employ them. You've got to build a process in that encourages people to stick with their best practices. And that's where I think the health checks that I talked about a little bit earlier become so important. You know, they're done, as I said, every 6 months or so, but they let you keep the focus on what the areas of opportunity were that were identified during the assessment itself. So when you go in there for that health check, you may still use an electronic survey to go and see if anything has changed in terms of people's perceptions. You can still go in and do a couple more walkabouts and interventions. Typically, you'd make them focused on the areas that have been identified as the major areas of opportunity. You can review the key performance indicators again, see how they've moved from when you were there for the major assessment. Look for deviations from improvement plans. If they're not making progress, why aren't they? What's holding them up? Is it a lack of people? Is it a lack of money? Is it a lack of will? Or whatever it happens to be. But the health checks, I mean, you know, when you go through and do an assessment and you try and make improvements, you may make some short-term improvements. But if you don't keep doing the health checks, at some point or other, you're going to end up with diminishing returns, where you see here the typical returns. People make improvements and they tend to gradually go back to the old comfortable ways of doing things. I mean, let's face it, you know, desserts taste good, so you may be eating a good diet, but every once in a while you used to have one dessert and you say, well, that tastes pretty good. The next day you have another, and the next day another, and so forth. So you're back in the old pattern. So the health checks have you keep your gains up at this higher level and hopefully keep you even moving in an upward trend over the time period. And also, too, you need to provide constructive feedback, and that's two-way feedback. So in this chart, I'm just showing you a way that, in this case, companies were benchmarked against 10 criteria over here. You can see how the plants in that corporation, how they scored on a scale of 0 to 10. And actually, in this case, 9.0 or above was a world-class performing organization. But you can see here that they had a number of areas where they were really at low performance, and they had some that were in fairly good here. But executives in the corporations need an overall status report that shows results of all the sites. This is one page of a type of report of that nature. But it also helps identify if you have systemic issues in a particular element. If you had one area that you had reds all across here, from a corporate basis, that would send up a red flag for you, telling you, look, we need to really go after this area of opportunity. If you've got a couple of greens here in some plants, that tells you, well, maybe I can send some guys from that plant over to a plant that's got a low score here and see if he can't help them implement some of the things that they did at the plant that was performing well. So really, it helps identify sites that are underperforming, helps identify and recognize high-performing sites for ones that are making improvements, but it gives you a big picture. And I typically recommend that when you have health checks or major assessments, when feedback is given both at the plant management level and the corporate level, that you have a multi-level team that provides that feedback. That the feedback doesn't just come from this, the higher level assessment team, but also comes from maybe a couple of hourly folks who participated and so forth. Because that gives them good visibility, it gives them something to talk about to their peers when they get back on the floor, and it makes it much more meaningful to them as they have a greater feeling for ownership on it. And just coming down to a kind of a summary page here, again, what I really say is you should have robust external assessments every 2 to 4 years, supported by health checks. And if you put me say, well, how often really? I say every 2 years for the robust one, with the 6-month health check in between. You've got to have a good governance process. And remember, that governance process stays in place ad infinitum. It doesn't go out, you don't just close it down after you've had the assessment done. It's an ongoing concept. You should identify your practices and metrics, taking into consideration the balanced scorecard concept. Make sure you're not just looking at financial indicators, that you're looking at things that help identify whether you're performing activities consistently and in a high-quality manner. Look at things that identify whether you're investing in your people from training and from tools. Increase the amount of awareness and understanding of your standards. Make sure people understand, if you're saying management leadership is one of the elements we're going to evaluate, what does management leadership mean to you? Or if you're talking about preventive maintenance, if you have 5 maturity levels from 0 or 1 maturity level being doesn't exist to 5 mean it's your best practice, what does the best practice look like in PM versus a no program in place, or versus something that's midway between them? Also, if you can, integrate some electronic tools into it to reduce costs and the intrusiveness on your site, but also make sure you incorporate the learning experiential activities such as the top walkabouts and the exercises that we discussed earlier. You've got to come up with a formal improvement strategy, ranked for priorities, and you have a concise report for your executives. So those are just kind of like a summary of some of the key recommendations that I've gone through in this last 45 minutes or so. So at this point, I know we've got 15 minutes left. I guess I'd open it up to you for comments or questions from the audience.
All right. Well, thanks, Andy. That was great. Just a few questions that came in. One was kind of talking more back to the learning effort side of things, and whether you favor a pre and post test to measure the learning effectiveness.
It kind of depends on what type of test you're talking. If you're just doing an assessment where if you're asking a person to take a test, a written test, I'm not sure I would go for that. That might be part of your training program, but I don't think I would necessarily make it part of the reliability assessment, although it could be a sub on it. But when you talk about there is pre-work I think you need to do. So let's say you're going to go on site and do an assessment on starting on July 4. And a couple weeks before that, I would have already sent out some sort of data request sheet to people, so that I could see what the performance numbers are, whatever they are, whatever information I want, the quantitative data. But if I come back in 6 months with a health check, I'm going to contrast those numbers that I had previously with the new existing numbers. And, you know, on that case, I look at that as kind of like a pre and post test, because really what you're saying is that you go and you assess them, you give them a 6-month time frame to make improvements, and you're coming back and evaluating them again using the same standards. So I'm not sure if that's the type of test the individual was looking for, but that's the way I would typically tackle it from an assessment or a benchmarking exercise.
Okay. And I know you covered it, but I've got a couple different questions, comments here from some different folks, so obviously might be something good to touch on again. But just kind of, again, that whole idea of communication, over-communication to staff to continue to drive the value and the importance of all of these things that you're talking about, and you know, maybe just a couple other key points that you could make about how to really keep this in front of people and stress the value.
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, communications is exceedingly important, and it really starts from the high level with the executive sponsor. And, you know, if you think from his level there, you have to evaluate what are the means by which he communicates today with his organization and with his sites. And what you have to look for is ways that in each one of those communication methods that you embed messages about what's going on in the benchmark. Because people base their actions on what they believe to be important. And if the executive sponsor comes to sites or sends out emails or notices or bulletins, whatever it has, and he never talks about the benchmarking activities and the resulting improvement activities, they're going to figure they're not important. But if every time he comes on site or every time he sends out an email, he talks about the importance of that benchmarking exercise and the activities are ongoing, and as a result of it, people start getting the message that, hey, this is important. And, you know, you can't say the message too often. I mean, the fact is, half the times we only retain 20% of what we hear anyway, and so really you have to get that message through multiple times to get people to really start taking it seriously. But, you know, companies now have you know, they've got bulletin boards, whether they're electronic bulletin boards or the hard, you know, the old standard bulletin boards out in the sites. You know, you have to keep information posted on those. If you've got newsletters, whatever they are, messages should be coming out from those. If you if you have key management meetings, that should be a topic on the agenda every time. You know, we all recognize now that, well, almost everybody does that. Whenever you start a meeting off, you start it off with safety. Well, I'm not going to say that you need to start a meeting off with reliability, but I'm just saying that as a part of those meetings, you should be trying to make one element of the agenda always talking about the benchmark and the resulting activities that are taking place on it. The other thing is that I think it's important to build some sort of recognition program for the improvements that people make, and there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. I mean, you know, some companies, I know Ford at one time, what they did is when a site actually achieved a certain level of performance, they would have a celebration where the executive sponsor came down to the site for a half day, and they did special things at the site to recognize everybody for it. I've seen other cases where people used, you know, kind of like these affinity cards where you earn points for making progress, and as they hit certain milestones, people convert those points into either merchandise or other things that they wanted to do on it. But I do think having a way to recognize performance is extremely valuable, and that's part of the whole communication thing, because it's communication coming back to us. And that's why I mentioned earlier I like to have, you know, if you've got improvement activities that are occurring as a result of the benchmark, have people from that team who are chartered with making the improvement, you know, and hopefully there are some hourlies on the team, have them make the presentations to the site management or even corporate management on what they've achieved. And because that has a big impact, and it actually is very important for the executives too, because they start seeing that the people down the floor believe in what they're doing. And I know that I worked with one company in the food industry once, where we had benchmarked all their sites, and as the plants made improvements, they sent teams that were made up of supervisors and hourly mechanics and operators up to the corporate headquarters to present what changes they had been able to achieve, to tell them what additional change was possible, and to tell them what type of support that they needed. So, and that's all part of the communication process too.
All right, great. And just, it looks like one more question, and then I had some housekeeping questions, which I'll address here in a second. But someone was wondering how you feel about cameras strategically located throughout the plant that are then tied to a central station. What's your thought on that?
Okay, I mean cameras for the purpose of, I guess I'd like to say, what you know, when they're looking at the reason for the movement there, is it just to see what's happening in the plant, or?
Well, I basically read it the way they wrote it. So
when you first said cameras, I was wondering about the position of cameras. You know, if you're coming in their role in an assessment or something like that, and you know, I was only thinking there about how you take you take your cell phones or a camera, whatever it is, and if you have permission there, take pictures of what you're seeing. And of that, I think that's extremely valuable, because you know, you may come back and tell people, well, hey, your housekeeping's not great or whatever, or we saw incidents of such and such. You know, if you have a camera that you can take a picture of that and show it, I think that just adds that much more impact for it. I'm not sure that's what the person was looking for, but from the benchmarking assessment process, I do see a role for cameras in that.
Gotcha. All right. A couple people have been asking about, you know, getting the presentation. So if you missed the beginning of my kind of intro, we are recording this. So what we do is we'll put the link to the recording up on our website, and I'll email everybody with the link. So if you had to drop out early or whatever, you'll have access to all the information that Andy provided us. So just wanted to answer. I had several of those come in, Andy. So. Well, I would imagine, do you have your contact information, Andy, on a slide, or do you want me to include that in the follow-up email I send to folks?
Yeah, if you can include that. I didn't have that on a slide here, but yeah, if anybody has comments about things, if they want to send an email, if they want to give me a call and just talk about things. I mean, you know, as I said, I've done a huge number of assessments with different types of methodologies and that, so I can talk quite a bit about pros and cons for them and that, so I'll be happy to do that.
All right, great. Well, I took the screen back from you, and as I mentioned, so when I send that follow-up email to everybody from today, I'll include Andy's email in there. So if you have some questions or comments, obviously you'll know how to get in touch with him, so that's cool. As I mentioned at the beginning, Plant Services sponsored this webinar for us today, and they do have an article that Andy wrote, What's Your Reliability and Maintenance Temperature, up on their website. You can see the link there. It's just plantservices.com/maintenance_assessment. I'll include that link in my email as well, but really great article there, so if you want a little bit of extra credit for your time here on our webinar today, that'll be a good reading assignment for you. Just to kind of close up here, and again, we want to thank Andy. Thanks again for taking the time today. Lots more information like this webinar is going to be, and all our previous webinars, up on our website, uesystems.com. All kinds of things about the different applications that you can use, ultrasound for our different training classes that we've got, and as I said, again, all the different webinars that we've held in the past, they're all up there on the website, so hopefully a great wealth of knowledge there for you. Couple different ways to stay connected with us in between these webinars. We've got our 2 users groups on LinkedIn, UltraProbe users and our Reliable Asset World group. The Reliable Asset World group is a great place to take conversations like the topics Andy talked about today. So that's a great place to have some more reliability, big picture asset management type conversations. And of course, for all of our users of our equipment, the UltraProbe users group is a great place for that. And if you're not a user of our equipment, please come check it out, see what folks have to say. Just a great place to ask questions, help answer questions, and just have that connection with your peers out there. We are on Twitter. We do have our blog as well, uesystemsblog.com, so check those out. And just a couple upcoming dates. Our next webinar is going to be Lorna Hall from Jacobs Engineering is going to come present on July 30th, and her topic is ultrasound at the Kennedy Space Station. So pretty cool. They're doing some really great stuff down there, so it should be a really good session. And then looking way far into the future, but you know, time flies, it'll be here before we know it, our Reliable Asset World and Ultrasound World conferences for 2015 will be June 2nd through the 5th. So mark those calendars and look for some additional information from us coming out here soon this summer. And of course our full training calendar is up there as well. I'll leave our contact us page up here just for a couple minutes so folks can jot these numbers down, and if you have any questions of us, just let us know and we'll be sure to get those answers to you. Again, Andy, thanks again. Hope everybody has a great rest of the day, and we'll hopefully see you here next month.
Okay, thank you.